Excellent. We have here members of the Falls Church who will share with us their journey into racial reconciliation. They have produced a report which is comprehensive, so comprehensive that they have been able to identify the names of people who were enslaved by members of their church. Although the African American Episcopal Historical Collection has accepted with gratitude and humility the efforts of other Episcopal parishes who seek to document and describe their race histories for the purpose of achieving reconciliation. There has been no other parish that has amassed the detail and done the depth of the work of the Falls Church. I think if it's okay, I would like to begin by asking you, Burl, what motivated you in 2022 to talk to the racial justice ministry about an audit?
So first, thank you, Riley, for the invitation. This is Burl Salmon. I'm the rector at the Falls Church, and I arrived there in July of 2021. Gosh, my years. And I think that the easiest answer to that question is I come from a world of complex histories. I'm a child of Mississippi, and I know that histories are often richer and more complex than the stories we have told to date. And so I came to the Falls Church, which was we trace our history back to 1732, and that's a long history. And we have a building constructed between 1767 and 1769 that has been long lauded and talked about. It has a relationship to President George Washington. It has a relationship to George Mason. And those things had long been celebrated in the history of the Falls Church. And so when I came there, that was part of the story. But I knew that this building in which we worshiped, the 1769 structure, had a much richer history. And it was a history of people of color. It was a history, most likely. We had no proof. There was nothing that said the building was built by enslaved persons, but there was no way it wouldn't have been or couldn't have been.
Mm-hmm.
And so I arrived and began hearing more of the histories and realized that we were missing part of a very significant history at the Falls Church. And so we had this amazing group that had been born after the reality of the George Floyd incidents and had done a lot of work.
Can you talk about that a little more?
I'm going to let Jan and Amy talk about
Okay.
that because that group pre-existed me. And when I arrived, there was this amazing group that had done amazing work. And then I got there and started thinking about this story and said, if there is a group in the Falls Church who could tackle this and understand its both necessity and the way to do it, it would be the racial justice ministry. So I proposed it and they ran with it. And so that really has been, my hands have been off of it. I have not done the work. Jan Cornelius and Amy Marshak and Jennifer Stacks have done yeoman's work in their free time on this project. And so they can speak to to their work. I simply asked that we consider it being done, and they picked it up and ran with it. So the story is theirs to tell.
Okay. Amy or Jan, who would like to begin? All right, Jan.
I can go real quick. So just about the history of our racial justice ministry. So that was actually started under the wardenship of my wife, Dr. Erin Mulbrat. And as Bill mentioned, in part response to the George Floyd incidents, and just the sense that people wanted to do something and to perhaps also to educate themselves more on race and racism in the United States. So I think initially, before we started on this project, we were focused a lot on education, and as a ministry, we still are. And yearly, we run the Sacred Ground groups, and as well as educational options during fellowship. We recently did one on linked descendants, and we have a series planned on that, for which obviously VTS is well known. And so we started out doing a lot of education, self-education, as well as education for the congregation. And once Bill talked to us about this project, I think we really sunk our teeth into it. Being guided by the tenets of the becoming beloved community idea that the National Episcopal Church has put forward. Amy, do you want to add to that?
No, I think that's a really good explanation of it. I think at least for me, what got me into this ministry for our church was really doing the Sacred Ground program in 2020. Um, Jan and I each facilitated a group of people who wanted to engage in these discussions and thinking about issues of race and racial justice from the perspective of the church was a really interesting um, opportunity and a interesting way to like approach the issues that came up in my work life and came up in various ways otherwise. But um, I think what drew us to this project, and maybe I can't speak for Jan, what drew me to this project though is the idea of if we're going to go out in the world and be part of the solution of racial justice, we have a lot of homework to do on our own for our own church, if we're going to do that as an uninstitutional basis. So I think that's what really drew me to the work as Burl proposed it of doing this project.
Now, before you came on, Jan talked about his childhood, ever so briefly, in apartheid South Africa. Where did you grow up?
It's not as interesting. I grew up in Rochester, New York, um, which
A Kodak family?
indeed a Kodak family. Both my mom and my dad were at Kodak, and my grandfather was at Kodak.
Mhm.
Um, uh, Having done the racial justice work now that we're doing and especially Sacred Ground, learning a lot more about Rochester in its own very clear redlining history has been really interesting too.
Yeah. I think one thing we know when we get into this kind of work, is that there are precious few, if any, places, particularly in America, that were not touched by race and racism.
Mhm.
Let me just say quickly, I grew up in Richmond, Virginia. I was born in 1949, during one of the heights of Jim Crow, and I went to all apartheid schools. I started school in 1954, the year of the Brown decision. And when I graduated from high school, an all-black high school in 1967, the schools were still segregated. Um, and you mentioned George Mason. My first school, public school, was named George Mason Elementary School in Richmond. Um, why did you choose, the path that you chose to do the work? Um, you obviously did great research into your members and their lives, particularly their lives vis-a-vis race and slavery. How did that happen? How did you know where to find the information? What help did you have?
So we kind of divided that up between primary sources and secondary sources. And I'll let Amy speak to the secondary sources side of things. But I think the most crucial conversation we had for primary sources was a conversation with Julia Randall, the historiographer for the Diocese of Virginia. She
Who
was
was
a wealth
for a
of,
time the archivist at
yes.
Virginia Theological Seminary. Yeah.
Oh, cool. Very good. She had a wealth of knowledge, and what she gave us was starting points. Where you should look, and what you should look for, and then also significantly, as a result of the church's various lawsuits, she had extensive, uh, extensive first-hand resource information from the vestry notes, for example, of the Falls Church going back for hundreds of years. So those are some pretty good research starting points. From there, we followed both kind of contemporary sources and tools and techniques, as well as old-fashioned archive work. So we looked at the wills of people who had. Well, we first kind of found all the clergymen and vestrymen. We try to find as many of their wills as possible. And in those documents, you'll see things like, I leave my enslaved persons to my wife or my children. And that way we were able to determine, who some of the slaveholders were by that method. And that a lot of that information can be online. One of the most significant sources of information was also the historical library in Fairfax City, where they have a slave archive. Unfortunately, it is not digitized, so you have to go there physically, and it's on little note cards. So you look up the enslaver, and associated with that person will be records of sale and the amount they were taxed yearly based on the amount of enslaved persons they had.
This is very important information because there will be other parishes
Mm-hmm.
who will consult this record that we're making tonight for the process which you came across. By the way, with digitization, what we know about the technology is that it will degrade over time, and that the best way of preserving records is on paper.
Oh.
What was the response of your congregation to this effort at first, and did it evolve? Surely it did over time.
I feel like Burl really should be the one to answer that question. From my perspective, people found it to be sort of an interesting thing we were doing. Now, an interesting note to put in about the Falls Church is we're a very unusual Episcopal congregation, is my understanding, because we are a young parish in a very old building. for the record of the thing, which I think we all know, but
Well, you may want to say so for
yes, for
posterity.
posterity is so the Falls Church was involved in a lawsuit in the early 2000s up to the early 20 teens. I think it ended 2012 about gender and sexuality in the Episcopal Church. There was a large congregation here at our church in the up until that point, that was a more conservative Episcopal congregation that when Gene Robinson was made a bishop in the Episcopal Church, decided they wanted to split off and take the building with them. The Diocese of Virginia, not so keen on losing the Falls Church building, fought that in court, and a small group of people stayed with the Falls Church and then grew, and it grew into what the Falls Church Episcopal is today. So there was sort of a self-selection of who chooses to be in our congregation starting from that moment. That's still so recent that we have a relatively young, relatively progressive congregation that's in this very historic space. And so I think we have sort of the perfect ingredients for a group of people being interested and willing to support this kind of research. And I don't know if Jan or Burl has a different impression on that, on the basics.
I sent over today, I think by email, a photograph and an essay that we found in the archives at General Theological Seminary, of all things. And I thought it was fortuitous that it showed up today. Burl, when did you arrive?
So I came in July of 2021, which is the tail end of COVID. And I think Amy's exactly right. It's a parish, to use a theological phrase, it's new wine in old wineskins. So, and really and truly, people do sort of self-select to be there. What's really curious about our parish is, unlike any other Virginia parish, and particularly a colonial Virginia parish, we have very few, if any, families in the parish that are tied to the history of the parish. So no one's grandmother gave a window at the Falls Church.
There's no Fitzpatrick.
No, there's not. No one's great-great-grandfather is buried in the cemetery. We have one family, and that is that, but otherwise they're not. We have no Confederate monuments anywhere around the church. We don't have a pew that says George Washington sat here, or Jefferson Davis sat here, or Robert E. Lee sat here. So of all Virginia,
but they did.
Most certainly Washington was there. Most likely Davis and Lee certainly could easily have been there.
Sure.
So we don't have this peculiar Virginia history, which makes us a really unique parish. And so we are both spared those controversies when they come, removing a window or taking a commemorative plaque off of a pew, because we don't have them. But also we don't have families that have that long story to tell us either, because everyone is new to the parish. So it's a double blessing, and unfortunate in that we don't have that kind of lived history for our people.
Do you think that enhanced the freedom to?
Absolutely, without question. Which truly does make us unique. I think of other parishes in the diocese that have begun this work, and that they truly have to wrestle with the folks that are really still there because they're connected to the history of the place, and we don't. We certainly have. We know that we have Confederate forces buried in our churchyard, and we know that we have Union forces buried in our churchyard. We know both of that. We have a plaque that acknowledges that. When you walk,
are the slaves buried there?
We don't know the answer to that question. And so that's one of the things I would love to find, is if there is documentation of that. What we know is that there are hundreds of people buried in the churchyard, and we have no idea who they are. They got buried at dark. They got buried overnight. There are plenty of vestry records that say the sexton arrived at the church and there was a burial overnight. And no one knows who it was, but it was sacred ground. And so the community came to bury their dead there. But I think it's a unique parish because we don't have that very peculiar Virginia history for us. And I think Amy's right. So I think the first response was, oh, how wonderful! I'm so glad that we're doing this. What an interesting exercise. And so there's a cerebral response to it, I think. What our next steps are, and Jan and Amy will speak about this, will take us beyond the cerebral and look toward what is our response.
You know, can we hold up on that for just one second?
Absolutely will.
When you were first of all, let me back up and tell you that we're doing this recording of our conversation, which will be transcribed within a day or two of the end of this recording. You will have an opportunity to review the transcript. I can tell you to the person, no one has opted to review the transcript, but it is the official record of this conversation. And the video only enhances it because, as we know, it's digitized and it will degrade and fade over time. But the paper will not. To what extent were there records in-house?
I can speak to one secondary source that comes from the church. I think the one of the issues is also as the article that, so let me speak to the secondary source first, then I'll add my second comment. This book, it's called Near the Falls, is 200 Years of the Falls Church, which someone wrote who was a member of the church.
And wrote when?
In 1969, I believe. So it was not particularly helpful for giving a lot of detail that we are interested in right now, but was helpful to have some of that sort of vestry background that by putting together the secondary sources with the information that Jan worked on, you could sort of piece together what things meant in this book that they weren't talking about. For example, when they say that the church building was paid for in whatever thousands of pounds of tobacco, that has a different meaning if you're thinking about it through the lens of the slavery economy of the time. And so it was helpful, and that was a resource from within the church, though you could buy it on Amazon, that we could use. I will also say that from that essay that you sent us, the church building has been in use and out of use and in many different uses over a long history. And then you also had where records ended up at the end of this litigation that my understanding is we did not have a lot of useful records in-house. We have lists of things like the list of rectors, that kind of thing in-house, but probably not a lot more than that. Jan, you can correct me if I'm wrong on that.
Yeah, so there were from Julie Randall again, some vestry notes and things of that nature that we did have access to, but none of them really talk about slavery or the enslaved to any significant degree. It's very similar to being on a vestry now, in the sense of we need to fix the fence and things like that. So there was not a lot useful in that, other than discerning who was on the vestry and then having that as a research lead.
And where did Julie Randall find her records?
I'm not sure. She must. I'm not sure. I think the vestry records must have been sent to the diocese at some point. I think that's kind of still the case.
It's a common practice in dioceses around the country. Yeah.
Yeah. So she definitely had all those in digital format, and she told me she had used them for many hours during the court cases that occurred.
So you have these wonderful records, and there are many questions that arise. Probably not the place here to examine them. For example, I did note that there were lists of the enslaved, and a few of them have a surname, most often not related to the surname of the owner. And I think that was rare. What? Yes.
I was going to say a lot of the Fitzhughs, enslaved persons had first and last names, and they had a lot of very detailed records, it seems, on the Ravenwood plantation, which took up most of the Falls Church, Annandale, Springfield area, or a big chunk of that.
And you found those records in the county?
Yeah, the Fairfax
You're-
County slavery archive.
Okay.
Yeah.
How was it received? How was this report received?
So I think we did a lot of pre-work when we first undertook the project. We had a adult formation lesson saying, "Hey, this is a project we're undertaking." A little bit before we announced the results, we kind of reminded people again, "Hey, this is what we're doing," and it's different to have a general acknowledgement. There's like, this was probably built by slaves, but to find out that your clergy owned slaves and traded slaves, and almost all the vestry men, because they were all men at the time, all the vestry men had slaves, and having some of their names and things like that. We wanted to prepare the congregation for that. So we had that first session telling people we're undertaking the research. We had a second session saying the research is coming out soon and it shows extensive ties to slavery. So we didn't give all the details, but we wanted to prepare people for that fact. I would say that we also provided the report ahead of time to the vestry.
Yes.
And the vestry were able to review the report and make suggestions on that document.
Were there naysayers?
I don't think there were naysayers per se, but there were recommendations that we had initially presented from the Racial Justice Ministry that through the vestry, after the vestry process had been changed based on the back and forth that we had with them.
Did you have people in the congregation? Burl, did you have people in the congregation who whispered to you their discomfort?
No, not a single one, which is part of the amazing thing about this, is that there was an eagerness, I think, on the part of the congregation this is sort of to hold on to latch onto. It's something slightly concrete to say this right here. The questions of race and justice are so often nebulous and abstract, and how do we do something? Well, here's this thing, and that we can hold on to this thing, and we can look to this thing. I received not a single negative comment, no sort of, hey, do you have a second conversations, none from anyone.
If you were a unified church, meaning unified with the church that departed, my suspicion is that given the history of families, that there would have been some pushback.
Perhaps.
Yeah.
And I simply don't know. I don't know the nature of that congregation. I don't know who they are or were. And so I can't conjecture to that. Could easily have been. But what I know is our reality is that there was no voice.
The one thing I just like to add about this is one of the reasons we did such extensive work on secondary sources and context in our report was we didn't want anyone to read the report and feel like what the Racial Justice Committee was doing was blaming the Falls Church for being uniquely bad or uniquely problematic. or saying that it was better than anybody else. Like, we didn't want to have unnecessarily negative reactions by taking things, by not providing enough context. And that's why there's such a lengthy part on sort of the history of what was going on in the area, in the Episcopal Church, in general.
Were there any indications at all? Well, what I know is that particularly in places like Virginia, Virginia is the example of this actually. There's an historian whose name is Spangler. And she wrote about the earliest Anglican churches in Virginia and the evidence that she uncovered that the parish itself owned slaves and rented out slaves to parishioners or not. And it was rather profitable. Any indication at all that there was church ownership?
I didn't see any explicit church ownership, but the rectors owned enslaved persons, certainly. And we know, and then they worked a glebe, which is the land that were given to the clergy. But I didn't see any records saying that the church itself owned enslaved persons.
Now, are we going all the way up to um, the Emancipation Proclamation for the end of slavery in your immediate vicinity, or particularly 2 years later, the end of the Civil War? Are we going right up to that point in your discovery?
So what I found in the research is that in the earlier colonial times, the rectors certainly had quite a lot of ties to slavery. Then the church went dormant kind of at the birth of the Republic. And it was about 40 years that there wasn't a completely official presence there. And on the return, the rectors at least the rectors did not seem to be slaveholders at that time. And we have more research to do on the vestrymen of that time. And now is probably also a good time to note that.
And what time are we talking about approximately?
After the 40-year hiatus, that puts us into the kind of Civil War type
Like
timeline.
1830s, 1840s is when
Okay.
people started to come back. Right, Jan?
Yeah.
Okay.
So,
sorry, go ahead, Jan. Didn't mean to interrupt. I thought you were done.
No, I just wanted to say that we do need to do more research into the vestry persons of that time. And throughout the report, we do note that there's a lot more research to be done.
I will also note that in terms of the specific date around the Civil War, so the Falls Church itself was pretty quickly taken over by the Union Army in the Civil War, and the
This whole
rector
area
fled.
fell soon.
And the rector fled, so it'd be hard I'm not sure, pinpointing to exactly which year would be kind of tricky for us because it wasn't really active at the time of the war.
What was typical in many places throughout the South when the Union Army, when this area fell fairly fast to the Union forces, white people left. And the black people who were left, in some cases, took over these churches and made them their own. We find that in South Carolina, particularly. We find it in North Carolina. And when the war was over, the whites came back and took the church back, the church heads. What's next?
So in our report, we make a couple of recommendations, well, a lot of recommendations, I would say, but we
Indeed.
break them out into a couple of categories. One being the most basic is speak the truth about the Falls Church's ties to slavery. And that's that main tenet of the Becoming Beloved community ethos. And that's what we're doing here, and that's why we published the report. And that's why when we published the report, we had a press release, and we didn't, hide our light under a bushel, as they say. We proclaimed that we had done this research, and this is what we had found. And I was really surprised at the response that we've got from kind of like-minded partners, the Social Justice Committee of Falls Church, the Memorializing the Enslaved in Arlington, the Cherry Hill Historical Society. A lot of people have been in touch to share best practices and to talk about what they're doing and to kind of get synergies together. VTS, of course, as well. So speaking the truth, that's one of the main tenets. We're seeking spiritual penitence. So, being a church, this is an obvious act for us. And we have actually scheduled lament service for June, I want to say. And Canon Reverend Lee Hill will be the speaker. And we'll invite...
From the diocese.
Yep, from the diocese. And we'll invite our partners and our congregation, of course, to take part in the spiritual lament. Another category is we suggest to make amends to communities we have wronged. And the first step that we hope to take there is to have a professional effort to uncover the full extent of the church's slaveholding practices. So
the church at large, or the Falls Church?
The Falls Church. So the group of us that did the research, myself, Amy, and Jennifer Stacks, we're amateurs. We did this on our spare time, and I know for a fact we didn't find all the wills, and there's just a lot more information that I know if we have a professional effort that we can find those the full extent of the slaveholding practices, and then potentially ultimately trace those folks back to people that live today, our linked descendants. Other categories we want to take action are to educate the congregation about ongoing racial justice issues, implement institutional changes that advance the cause of racial justice, and create and bolster ties to lay and ecumenical organizations committed to racial justice. So those are the categories that the group came up with and suggested to the church. And we also have kind of a sequencing of what actions we want to do when. This year, we're looking at the lamentation service. And then the big one, and this was the point of debate with the vestry, was whether how we approach our linked descendants or attempting to find our linked descendants. And the Racial Justice Ministry took the approach, we should do this. And at the end of our negotiations, we are at a point now where we will have a discernment process, engaging the church and to discuss this matter. And it's a weighty matter which is due a strong conversation.
In what way is it weighty?
I think people have a lot of emotional response to undertaking this work. So I think the folks on the vestry at the time wanted to get more input into how we would do it. I think it's not something that should be entered into lightly.
Yeah.
And if you phone somebody and tell them that their ancestor may have been enslaved by someone at the Falls Church, you want to phone them having thoughtfully thought about how you want to engage with them, and how you want to go forward into the future with them. So to be conscious about those kinds of things.
You know, in many ways, you are fortunate to be able to have a deliberative process here. There are other institutions, for example, Georgetown University, that made a shocking discovery, and they had to get to work very quickly. And there was information coming in over the transom, probably so fast that they couldn't keep up with it. You have a more iterative process, which I think is probably provides, I wouldn't say leisure, but it provides an opportunity to do. You know, my father used to tell me all the time, don't surprise people. Never surprise them. Always bring them along. So I think that's probably what you're doing. Now, how do you propose? And for what purpose? Are you trying to locate descendants, inevitably some who are right in your vicinity?
I know I've spoken a lot, so I'll have a few words, and then I'll turn it over to the other folks. But I wasn't super familiar with the concept of linked descendants, to be honest, until I went to James Madison's Montpelier estate, and I attended a lecture that included the linked descendants and the chair of their linked descendants committee, who ultimately became the chair of the whole Montpelier Foundation.
Yeah.
And I was really moved at how powerful it was that the linked descendants were re-engaged with that foundation, and that they had begun the process of repairing the breach with one another, and that the linked descendants refer to themselves as the forgotten founding fathers. And I thought that was a very powerful lecture I attended there. And when I learned about VTS's own efforts, that was also very intriguing. So I think if I had not had those experiences, I'm not sure I would have been as strong an advocate for this. But I could see how wonderful it was at Montpellier that the linked descendants had a say, and they all, I think, they had a vision for that estate, and were able to have inputs into how that went. So the utility, it's a long way of saying, I think the utility would be an opportunity to repair the breach with those that the church has wronged, if those people are open to that. Because I could imagine, and I understand that this is the experience with VTS in some instances, and Montpellier as well, that a linked descendant is not interested in hearing from the institution. But I think the onus is upon us to make a move to repair the breach.
I would also recommend, I'm trying to think, I don't have it right here in front of me, and I usually do. There was a study done by Ed Ball, whose father is a graduate of VTS. Ed Ball is a descendant of um, several generations of plantation owners in South Carolina. He did what you are doing, and he went and before he spoke to anyone, tracked the people and found their descendants and wound up knocking on doors, taking people by surprise, which worked well in some cases. And as you can imagine, he got a few doors slammed in his face. But he's chronicled all of that in a book called Slaves in the Family, and I recommend it highly. Um, well, also in Montpelier, you had a place that people could identify with. Not having a place, at least I assume, what effect do you think that might have? You don't know yet.
Yeah, I'm not sure about the effect it will have, but I do recognize the difference between the Falls Church and the historic homes that we've visited. The most striking being that we're still a working parish, and we're still charged with the same work that we were charged with, hundreds of years ago. So our main goal is not education like many of the old plantation hounds, but I want us to be a better steward of our history as well. One of the recommendations, and we talked about that a little bit earlier, is to understand who is buried at the Falls Church, and perhaps to include the enslaved persons. And to have a more another recommendation again about telling the truth is updating our historical tour, which we do have, but to include the fuller story. And
Now, does the fuller story include what the parish was like, for lack of a better term, culturally, for the enslaved? In other words, would enslavers bring their house servants, for example, who were slaves, to worship with them? And if so, how did that work?
That's really interesting you asked that, because Bo talked to me just last week about whether we knew if enslaved persons were allowed to worship in the church, and oftentimes in the balcony. We have a balconied section, but it kind of postdates the slavery era. So I don't know the answer to the question. I did look at a lot of our annual reports about baptisms, confirmations, things of that nature, and it's always very, very low number of non-whites.
But not unheard of.
Bevon?
Not unheard of.
Yeah, it'll be like 3 in a year, or something like that. And they break it down by race, of course, because it was Virginia during that
Well,
time.
everywhere. It was remarkable.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So not much more to say on that, I'm afraid.
One of the reasons I asked that question is I find it fascinating. I think buildings themselves tell us their stories,
Absolutely.
if we know how to read it. And I was always fascinated that there were plans for a balcony in the original Wren proposal that he gives the vestry, but the balcony doesn't exist. He doesn't get around to building the balcony. And so there is not a balcony at the Falls Church until 1959. There never was. And so we don't know. And I asked Joe Eubank, who's our archivist, is there a record of of the enslaved coming with their families? Are there records of benches in the back where they would have sat? Would they have sat in, because we had box pews? Would they have sat with the families in their pews? And we just have no way of knowing.
Or
Um,
drawings or paintings.
none.
Yeah.
And the records that the clergy do make about baptisms they don't indicate where they happened, whether they happened on the plantation or they happened at the church. There is no record of that, so we really don't know the answer to that question.
Some of the pilgrimage I've been on in this immediate area have pretty solid evidence of what was going on in a worship service, in terms of who was allowed into the church, and who could not. It was unusual for someone who was not white to be confirmed, baptized, but not confirmed. To be confirmed is make you fully human and a part of the household of God, which is why I wanted to bring that up, because a couple of times in the middle of our conversation, I saw an opportunity to address what you're doing theologically as a consistent with the baptismal vows, which might help you with a level of discomfort or comfort that you might encounter. Humanity.
It's
Restoration.
funny that you say that. I was just reading the theological report, the Beloved Community Theological Report from the Episcopal Church from a few years ago, and there's a lot in there about how restoration and reparation are and equal footing brotherhood and sisterhood of all humankind is a key part of the baptismal vows. And so, yes, I took a lot of notes on good quotes from that we can use to arm ourselves as on a theological basis.
Well, that's very exciting, actually. When you find, as you will inevitably, the descendants, what do you foresee in terms of the relationship? What would you want?
So when I think of the relationship, again, I look at Montpellier, where they had a descendants committee and the committee of the institution. I have, I think, personal vision or hope that it's not necessarily one that's articulated or support, something that the church has come up with. But I would love to be able to have like a spiritual reconciliation with the linked descendants, but also turn that into something for contemporary benefits, in the sense that creating a fund which we could provide seed money for, and then to turn over the management of that to the descendants committee for their use in what they
Management
do.
of that, what is that?
Like I said, this would be my vision. It's not the
Yeah.
good, but they would control the fund and use it for the purposes they see fit.
What do you see, Amy?
Bebon?
No, I was asking what Amy sees.
Oh.
Yeah, I think that's yes, I think that would be the dream vision. and figuring out how to get to the economic justice piece of it is hard. But I think Jan's absolutely right about what the vision would be on a monetary basis. I think one of the future phases of our research, so we're going to do more research sort of going from the end of slavery up through closer to the present of our church's role in issues of race relations. That's our next phase of research. But then we also want to do sort of a contemporary audit of our practices as a church to see what are we doing that may have unintentional impacts. And I think if we have a descendants community, one piece of that too would be having a voice on if we're considering changing practices, that kind of thing, what should those practices be? And so I think that's another piece of it too.
Yes. You mentioned reparations. Let me just say that we're not always talking about money when we mention reparation. Repairing the breach. And money seems incidental when that is the goal. Or it appears to me. I don't know how it will appear to others. I'll give you an example. When I came to Virginia Seminary to register for class and to pay my tuition, I was writing a check and someone came up to me and told me not to write the check. And I thought, oh my God, they've changed their mind. But it wasn't that at all. It was that I was a Bishop Payne scholar, meaning that when Virginia Seminary sold the assets of the Bishop Payne Divinity School, the apartheid school, they put the revenue from the sale into a trust for the education of Black Episcopalians. And that makes them Bishop Payne scholars. So we don't pay a tuition. It's been paid for. So that's one kind of thing. When people talk about reparations, initially, they want to talk about slavery. But what you're talking about is slavery's legacy.
Yeah, I was recently at VTS for an excellent church-wide conference on institutional reparations, and the takeaway from that was for reparations specifically, think about the number you have in your head, add a zero, and then commit yourself to systemic change through social justice causes, and that combined together, social justice and the monetary aspect was what was emphasized there.
So I want to add just something about language. I come from a world of levees. Levees and worlds that flood if the levee isn't there. So Mississippi and Louisiana, much of which is below sea level. And it's all protected by levees. And the job of the levee is to keep safe, the folks within the levee system. Because there is a body of water, traditionally the Mississippi River, whose natural inclination is to flood. That's what it does by nature. And so we build levees in order to protect ourselves. And so the verb breach is a part of the vocabulary that I grew up with.
Yeah.
It was a regular word. We used it often, and it was a word of terror. Because if the levee was breached, then people died.
Yeah.
As a result, and livelihoods were destroyed, and homes were destroyed, and crops were destroyed for years because of a breach of a system that we trusted. And it happened, and it happened often, but we lived in fear of the word breach. And I think about when we talking about repairing the breach,
Mhm.
that we have an obligation as those who breached our brotherhood, those of us who breached the understanding that these are children of God. Um, and I didn't do it, and my parents didn't do it, but my system did, and it's a system in which I participate, and I lead an institution that participated in the breach at some level or another, or included people who had participated in that. So the legacy is how we repair the thing that damaged, the legacy of the damage that is centuries old, that is, of course, financial and economic, but is also moral, that is also spiritual, that is also ethical, that is also political. What is our job to repair the fissure in the system
Mhm.
that that we have benefited from? And so that's the literally the vision in my head when I hear repairing the breach. I literally see us going to a levee and stemming a flood that's coming across, or may have happened a long time ago, but we now have the responsibility and perhaps the resources to repair that fissure that happened.
And the resultant injury.
And the legacy
Yeah.
that lasts lifetimes of that breach.
What mistakes did you make?
I'm not sure we know the answer to that question yet.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I'm sure we will find out, but I'm not sure we know yet. I think one that I'm aware of is, I think when we brought the report to the vestry and our series of recommendations, one was not bringing them along with us far enough in the conversation of what we were asking them to. I think that to sort of sign on to and what is approved and what is just a moral support and how to think about the things we were proposing. And so I think so far that was the one mistake I can think of, was a conversation with a lot of people who really did support the effort that went less well than perhaps it could have, in terms of them thinking about what we're talking about, what's the timeline we're talking about, what's our vision for this. And that's the one that I can think of.
So you have to be in regular and conversation,
Yeah, and I think it's
more
always
than
important to
episodic.
remember, yes, but also how you present information matters. And what you've gotten used to as the scope of information may be really big to somebody else who hasn't sat with that information for 2 years, right? Uh, so I think that can be hard to keep other people's perspectives in mind.
What were the surprises?
For me, the big surprise was the scope of the slaveholding was way more than I thought it would be. Even when we started the initial research, you would find a will of a rector or something like that, and he maybe had like one or two enslaved persons that he left to his ancestors. But then kind of the balls started getting rolling, as it were, and the more and more research came in, and the scope was surprising to me, even compared to before, the very beginning stages, and then at the end. Um, as well as the fact that before Amy did her research, before the Sacred Ground course, I didn't really know that the clergy persons would be enslaving people, and so the fact that we still have a rector at the Falls Church, and at least 6 rectors of the Falls Church have owned enslaved persons. I mean, that hit me pretty hard. And then another link that Amy made, which I think was significant, and Julia Randall too, was that not only was the church built by enslaved persons, but the money for the tobacco that was the that was gathered to pay for the church was also made by enslaved persons. So the funding, the bricks, the wood, the roof that we're looking to rebuild now, the whole system played into our church being built, and every single aspect of that was as a result of slave labor, not just like the physical building of the church, so it's also the financing. That was surprising to me too. And then again, for some of the folks, we were able to track that the descendants are alive today. And in the report, we say there's at least 21 linked descendants alive today. That was a surprise for me too. I don't know why it was a surprise. Maybe I had not thought deeply enough about that. I think it's one thing to know like vaguely, oh, this church was built during the slavery era, and then there's another thing to know that, well, there was a guy named John who was enslaved by the rector or something. So the how personal it came to be as well. Those are the surprises for me.
I think you might also find, of course, you can't go poking around in the walls of that church, but if there's ever an occasion where you might have to take a closer look at the structure itself, I would say it would be typical to see some evidence that seeks to identify the person who laid the brick. They found that to be true at the Bray School in Williamsburg. They found it to be true at Christ Church in Elizabeth City. And I saw it in an old home in Charleston, South Carolina. A descendant of a builder took me under the staircase to show me his great-grandfather's signature. I was here. It's interesting how people take ownership and become a part of the community in that way. What do you hope to find over the course of the next few years? I mean, if you could close your eyes and dream, what's the vision?
I think if I'm dreaming big, one is that we are able to fund more of the research and identify more enslaved persons and their descendants, that we build a meaningful descendants community that I hope transforms how we think about our relationship to each other and the church. I also hope that this is useful to other people, either within Falls Church, because one thing we've heard sort of from the representatives of the government is back in colonial times, the Falls Church was the government of the Falls Church area. And so our history is their history in some sense.
Yeah.
That it's a useful model to people as they're sort of figuring out what to do in Falls Church or at other similar churches.
You know, that's kind of what informs my questions. What did you find? What surprised you? What other people expect when they do what you did? What about your vision, Jan?
I share Amy's vision, and my hope is that the reconciliation with the descendants happens, and it's not a transactional relationship. It's a deep relationship where we break bread, and we do the work of Jesus together. Um, and that our congregation, is united in living into that as well. Like we bring everybody along in the congregation too.
What do you see, Burl?
I think one of the moments of the Holy Spirit is that we share in all of this. So there's nothing that Jan and Amy have said that I am not a part of.
Yeah.
That is exactly where I wish to be. So it's not there's a synchronicity, but I don't think it's a synchronicity. I call that the Holy Spirit, that we are working together, that she is calling us into something that's much larger. My hope is that it increases our awareness. It changes the way that, or we become aware, and that we change the way that we interact with communities. But my hope is also that that we there are others watching us, and I am aware that there are others watching us. And my hope is that by doing this incredible work, others do the same thing. Others realize we too have a fuller history that we could be telling. And so how do we do that? I have loved the fact that different organizations have been in touch with Jan, because they're wanting to know, how did you do this? How did you start? Where are you going with this? And that this is one of the little bits and ways that we build a kingdom, one of the little bits and ways that we increase awareness, that we tell a fuller story, that we repair a breach, because it's a part of our nation. It's a part of our national story. And so how is it that we are participating in retelling the story of our nation, our church? How are we participating in the story of retelling our church? That's my hope. We're all on the very same page.
Yeah. Yeah. One of the things that I foresee as an archivist, which I'm not really, but as an archivist, is that what you develop, uncover, produce will provide the basis for scholarship. These kinds of stories that you are researching have just begun to be told. So in many ways, you're pioneers and in the vanguard. What I would like to see is if scholars would come to Virginia Seminary to do research that you produce and make available to us, as other parishes are beginning to do and have done. I'm not suggesting in the least bit that you turn over everything to Virginia Seminary. But you know what I mean. There has to be a way for the church to do what Burl just described, to tell the story of this part of our nation. Particularly when our efforts to tell the story are being sabotaged as we speak. I may have to come back to you to ask more questions. But in the meantime, and I always ask this question, what did you anticipate that I would inquire about or ask that I have not talked about, that I've not asked you about, but you really want me to know, and you really want to be a part of the record?
think the one thing that I would want someone to know doing this in the future, to reframe your question a different way,
Yeah,
is this work takes a lot of time.
yeah.
So to the extent you think we're going to delve in and do this pretty quickly, it is a long-term continuing project, especially if you are doing this as amateurs and on the side of your full-time jobs.
Let me tell you, you bowled me over. I have never seen this detail. It took my breath away. You've set a high standard.
Thank you.
What is the end product?
Well,
Or is it too early to ask the question?
I think we don't know the full end product, and I think this is a very long-term ongoing project we've gotten ourselves involved in here. I think the end product of the written product will be this more complete report that goes through the different historical periods as well as into the present. And then that will sort of form the basis of the work that we do on an ongoing basis. But as we're working on later phases of the research, we're also moving forward with the discernment process around linked descendants and what we're doing with the information we already have.
And I think, of course, the outputs of all of this, hopefully, a uh, just, more just world and more, more aware community. So.
There is a an organization, can't remember the name now, that happens when you get to be my age. And when there was a deed of sale that I found in an auction house, and for a slave named Betsy, who was sold in 1835 in Spotsylvania County. And she's to be held and enjoyed. We know who sold her and we know who purchased her. When I spoke to the researchers, they assured me that that was a lot of information and enough information to find her descendants. What you have done here is to provide a lot of information. Do you feel that? Or do you know it?
Yeah, I think especially in the instances where we have first and last names, especially some of the names are not super unique, like Bosse, Bosse. I mean, they are unique. The little experience I had, I was just on like ancestry.com. You can kind of take that back pretty far, and you can follow those breadcrumbs. Certainly. So to find first and last names, I think we're very, I hate to use the word fortunate in this instance, but we were fortunate to be able to find the first and last names. And I always also thought it was interesting that, some of the notes include, William Becker was a cook, or Dick Becker was a tanner, just like those little extra descriptions. Sometimes it'll be Samuel, brother of James, and then next it's like James, brother of Samuel. Just those little tidbits that kind of give you a richer understanding, and I think also humanizes the enslaved persons to the degree that just the ephemeral there were enslaved people here does not convey.
And to identify them in that way, brother of Samuel, brother of John, is a restoration of much of their humanity. They weren't simply the tanner. Well, I want to thank you for making yourselves available to the African American Episcopal Historical Collection. And I hope this will be the first of many conversations as I see guidance from you about how to preserve in our archive what you have produced already, not to supplant whatever it is that you need to do, but certainly to have it there to tell a richer story. And I don't think we will have done our job if we don't do that.
Really, I agree wholeheartedly. And in one of our recommendations for the report is the Falls Church needs to have more of its information available to researchers. And so in this way, you're helping us to tell the truth about the Falls Church, but also to provide our information in a way that is researchable and usable for scholars, but also for the families of the descendant communities as well. So thank you very much for allowing us to into your project.
Well, the other thing I think I would like you to be mindful of is the process that you used to uncover the information, in addition to the information itself, which is really remarkable, but how you found it. What were your steps? Because people are stumbling around all over the place doing what you have already done. And I want to congratulate you on doing this. And I can't tell you how grateful I am. Okay, you'll be hearing from me with the transcript very shortly.
Thank you, Riley, so much. We are honored to be included in this conversation, and thank you for all of the work that you do. I am really, really proud of Amy and Jan and the work that the ministry continues to do for the Falls Church. And we have more to do, and we will do it.
I think we will all have left this place permanently before the job is finished. Right? All right. Good night. Thanks again.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank you.